I stand before you, yes, as a professional, and sure, I guess that's an important part of who I am, but more importantly, I stand in front of you as someone who lives and has lived with a mental illness. And so from that, I have to say thank you. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for dedicating your life and your passion to help people like myself. Without you and professionals, I wouldn't be standing here. So what I'm going to do today is I will walk through a little bit of my story. So what it's like, or what it was like, and what it is like to live with a chronic mental illness. Then we will go into some of the takeaways regarding obsessive compulsive disorder. So I want you to get that personal side, but I also want you to leave with a good understanding of what OCD looks like clinically, how we properly treat OCD, and what some options are when there's so many barriers to getting the right treatment. We know that there's barriers all around for all sorts of disorders, but for OCD particularly, we see a lot of barriers regarding like finances and geographical location. So we'll talk about all of that. We'll talk about options. And then at the end, we'll have quite a bit of time. I will make sure I leave for Q&A. Please know that I don't believe in confidentiality for myself, so I am an open book. So whatever you want to ask, whatever comes to mind, write it down and let's discuss it later. That's how we're really going to learn and grow. If there's something that happens to be too personal or that I don't want to answer, I'll let you know. That has never happened to me in my life. So we'll see if you guys can stump me. So who am I? Where do I come from? What's kind of my story? I am from Houston, Texas, so not too far down the road. Born and raised in Houston. I grew up in Houston on the north side, what you would seem or see as a normal life. I had two working parents. Both my parents worked full-time. My parents owned businesses in Houston. My dad started a furniture store in the early 80s with my mom, and then my mom moved over and started running our tennis club. And so I grew up in a family that, sure, we had kind of a normal nuclear family, but people who worked all the time. So my parents were very, very busy at work, gone most days, but present when they weren't working. We had a nanny who helped raise us. She lived with us. This is an important part of my story, so that's why I'm sharing it. And she became my mom in the sense that she's the one that did a lot of our everyday activities with us, and so she was a really big part of our life. I have an older brother and an older sister. My brother's 5 years older. My sister's just 14 months older. So my sister and I have this bond that feels like we're twins, but we're not, where we did mostly everything together growing up. My brother was a little bit older, so although he was in the picture, he was doing more boy things than girl things, and a little more advanced than we were. But I lived a normal life. I did well in school. I excelled academically. There wasn't any red flags. I did well socially, had a good friend group, and I was pretty athletic. So I was an Olympic hopeful gymnast at Caroli's. There was 3 of us who are still my best friends to this day. And we did gymnastics very actively and competitively. We went to the gym from 5:30 to 7 in the morning, and then went to school, and then back to the gym from 3:30 to 9 at night. And so I believe this because I think it's important to talk about. I don't think my OCD or my illness could come about because I was so preoccupied. So we saw little things here and there that would start to pop up, and we wondered what was happening, or I wasn't sure if it was normal. But, kids are kids. We all have tendencies. We all have quirks. At what point do you say, is this normal or is this a problem? So at the age of 12, I got pretty burnt out of gymnastics and I quit. And as soon as I quit, we started to see all these things start to come up that became things that I couldn't just hide, or we couldn't just say, is this normal? When I was a young kid, before we saw the symptoms, I did little stuff. Like I would track the weather and tell my parents that they shouldn't leave for the day because there's a tornado in Kansas and it could be dangerous, and they would have to explain that we lived in Texas, so it was fine. But, little things like that. I remember reading the book Matilda and sitting in the car with my mom, and every time I read, I had to start at page 1. And I remember my mom looking over and saying, Liz, There's bookmarks, and that's what bookmarks are for. You put the bookmark in so you can start where you left off. And I couldn't fathom the concept and wasn't willing to accept that kind of anxiety that came with starting in the middle. I had to start at the beginning. So little stuff here and there, but it wasn't a problem. I was still sleeping well, I was eating well, I was functioning, I was doing well academically. There weren't any big signs that made you say, what's going on? And then I quit gym, and I had a lot of free time, and slowly things started to change. Now, can I blame quitting gymnastics? Can I blame adolescence and puberty, right? There's so many things that happened at one time that there's no way for us to know if there was a cause or if there was a reason, and it's irrelevant. We'll talk about that later, but it doesn't matter as far as OCD goes. But so, at 12 years old, I started having these bizarre, intrusive thoughts. I started having these thoughts that if I don't wash my hands, something bad is going to happen to someone I love. If I don't do this ritual, I might not go to heaven, or a family member might not go to heaven, and it's going to be my fault. If I wear the colors of red or black, I'm wearing colors of the devil, and so that's blasphemous, and God's going to be upset with me. If I don't ask these questions a certain way, then there's going to be a bad outcome. Some terrible thing's going to happen, and again, it would be my fault. And this reoccurring theme of this thought that caused this immense amount of anxiety and made me feel horrible, right? If you don't do this, something bad's going to happen. And so all of a sudden, you start doing these behaviors. And what happens that's really interesting is that when you do these behaviors, you actually feel better. So that anxiety and all those fears around those intrusive thoughts truly do go away as soon as you ritualize. And so pretty quickly, I was washing my hands and doing all of these bizarre rituals, and I didn't know what was happening. I knew it wasn't normal. I knew that I didn't present or look the same as my family and friends that were my age, but I didn't know what was happening. And when you're a kid and you don't know what's happening, and the way society talks about mental illness, and the way people perceive and understand individuals with mental illness, you're scared to death. And so what do you do when you don't know what's happening and you're scared to death? You keep quiet. And so you start to fight this battle that's accountable on your own. I didn't tell my mom, I didn't tell my dad, I didn't tell my sister, because what would they think? What would they do? What would that mean? You see, the difference with OCD compared to a lot of other mental health conditions is that we know what we're doing doesn't make sense, yet we feel like we have to do it. So it's much different than an illness that includes some sort of like psychosis or low insight, where you're doing these behaviors and you think they make sense and they're logical. With OCD, that's not the case. You're doing these behaviors, you know they don't make sense, you know you shouldn't be doing them, yet you feel like you have to, because if you don't, what if? Right? It's all about that uncertainty of what if. And if the what ifs were about a random person walking down the street, maybe I could let it go. But when the what ifs are about yourself or your family members not going to heaven or not surviving, or these huge, scary things that are about people you love, it's much harder to let them go. And so I started telling my family members that I was having an allergic reaction to the soap because my hands were cracked, raw, and bleeding. And my mom and dad got rid of all the soap at our house and our businesses and switched brands, thinking that's what was going on. And I would slowly make up things that weren't true. Not fabricated huge stories, but I would say little things like, oh, I think I left something in the bathroom when I was really going back to wash again, or, let me go grab something else from my room when I'm really going to ritualize, right? But slowly I'm engaging in rituals more and more, but I'm afraid to talk about it. And so intrusive thought after intrusive thought and ritual after ritual, things started to get worse. My mom was starting to notice little things here and there, but she didn't know, again, is this something hid? Or is this something I should be concerned about? And so I will never forget, I was in the 7th grade, and so I was about, I guess you're about 13, 14 at this time, and my sister was in the 8th grade, so she was a year ahead of me. We were going on a school trip to Mo Ranch. I don't know if y'all have heard of that. It's like a team building. It's a nightmare for someone with OCD, but that's okay. So we were going to Mo Ranch, my school grade, and my sister was going to DC for her school trip, and our trips fell at the same time. And so the night before our trip to Mo Ranch, I was supposed to go stay at a friend of mine, a friend Taryn's house in the Woodlands, because my mom needed to drive my sister to the airport in the morning to go to DC. My dad goes to work really early. My dad's motto growing up was, late to bed, early to rise, work like hell and advertise. And if you know my dad, that's what he does. So he was at work all the time. And so my mom was kind of the driver, would take us to school, take us to work. So she was going to take me to my friend Taryn's house and my sister to DC the next morning to the airport. And so the night before, I was dealing with so much anxiety, and I had hidden my OCD for so long that it kind of started to come out in a way that I couldn't really contain it, but no one knew what was happening. So I started asking my mom all these questions. I had this huge amount of anxiety about going to a friend's house and staying the night. And so I said, well, Mom, Taryn and their family, they put their dog in a kennel, and what if something happens to the dog while I'm there? Is that going to be my fault? What if when I unpack my bag, some of the clothes that I have are the same color or the same style as her clothes? Is she going to think I'm copying her? And if I'm copying her, does that mean she'll be mad at me? And she's mad at me, would she hurt herself, and would that be my fault if something bad happens to her? And all of these thoughts, I started to ask my mom, what we call reassurance. And my mom hadn't heard these. She had no idea what was happening. She knew these weren't normal thoughts. So her response was, Liz, if it's causing you that much anxiety to go to Taryn's house, just don't go. It's okay. You can stay the night here, and your brother can take you to school in the morning. So that's what happened. And so my brother, who at the time I guess was about 17, took me to school. And on the way to school, my brother said, "Hey, Liz, will you put that CD in?" And this is back when we had CDs. I don't think we even have those anymore. But so I take the CD and I start putting it in and out of the CD player, and I'm counting and I'm ritualizing. And my brother thought it was kind of strange, but he didn't want to say anything. And I think I started asking him a lot of reassurance of, well, do you think Mom and Laura are going to be okay, and what's going to happen? Laura's my sister. And my brother thought, I don't really know what's going on, but again, doesn't seem normal. And so he dropped me off to go to Mo Ranch for the week, and he called my mom or talked to her when he got home that night, and he said, Mom, I don't know if there's something happening with Liz, but she was doing some weird things. She was asking me a lot of weird questions, and she seemed to be counting when she was doing different stuff, and I don't know what's happening, but it was kind of concerning. And this was the first time my mom had ever heard somebody else acknowledge that something might be going on. And so her response was, well, James, I've been noticing some stuff too, and I don't know what's happening, but, maybe I need to start thinking about this and get it addressed. So while I was gone that week, without me knowing, my mom started asking people questions. She started talking to different people and letting them know what my symptoms were. So excessive hand washing, some reassurance seeking, and she started to try to inquire about what might be going on. Back when I was diagnosed with OCD, nobody knew what the acronym OCD stood for. We had never heard of it. It was very rare that you really knew what it stood for or what it was. And so she started to try to gather information, because that's what a parent does. You want to fix it. You want to help your child. And that Friday, after a week at Mo Ranch, my mom came to pick me up, and she describes that experience as the first time she knew I had gone from a child who could function to someone who was sick and debilitated by an illness. When I walked off the bus, I was a fit young kid, and I'd probably lost 5 to 10 pounds that week, and I stepped off the bus, and I looked gaunt. I had bags under my eyes. She could tell I probably hadn't bathed all week, and I was physically and mentally exhausted. Those of you that are practitioners in the room, you know what it's like when we're struggling with mental illness. You can sometimes visibly see it from the outside. Not always, but sometimes it crosses the line where it's visible that something's going on. And I walked off the bus and I got in the car, and we knew this was much bigger than a kid being a kid. By the time we got home, all I did was beg my mom to not make me go back to school on Monday because I was exhausted, and school was a really big trigger for me. I hadn't talked to her about that yet, but I felt like, just please don't make me go back. And so my mom started one of many deals that she would make with me throughout my illness, and her deal was, Liz, I won't make you go to school if you tell me what's going on, so that we can try to get you help and make you well. But if you don't tell me what's going on, then you have to go back to school. I can't let you stay home without talking to me. And I'll never forget, I was 13, sitting on my carpet floor in my bedroom at my parents' house, balled up with my arms wrapped around my knees, and I just started crying. And I remember saying to my mom at that time, I don't even know what the word ritual means, but it seems to fit for what I'm doing. But I'm having all these weird, horrible, scary thoughts, and if I don't do these rituals, then something bad might happen. Woo! Sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. And so my mom's explanation was that of most moms, that's not valid, and that if you don't do these rituals, nothing bad's going to happen. Those are just weird thoughts, and you can just let them go. And the thing is that if I could just let them go, I would have just let them go, but I couldn't. They were so anxiety-provoking, and they were so scary to me, and they were about people I love the most. I couldn't take that risk of something bad happening. And so we started this journey of searching for care. I grew up in Houston, Texas, fourth largest city in the United States, biggest medical center in the world. Okay, biggest medical center in the world is right down the road in Houston. You would think that means there would be a lot of available and effective care. Going back to my parents' work ethic, I think it's important to note, because it is an important but sad truth of my story and of society. My parents are very successful. They've worked very hard for what they have. They came to Houston with very little money and started a business, but have really worked their way up. And so finances weren't a barrier to my treatment. My parents were willing to spend whatever they needed to spend, do whatever it took to get me well. And so we went from therapist to therapist, psychiatrist to psychologist to social worker to doctor, and we were told the same thing. We've never seen a case as severe as hers. There's not help available for this child, and you should accept the fact that she'll probably live in a hospital for the rest of her life. The crazy thing is that practitioners are willing to say that to a 13-year-old. That I still can't quite comprehend. But when you're a kid and you're going to someone who's supposed to help you and somebody who's supposed to know what to do, you don't know what to do except believe them. So when that's what you're told and you see that you're not getting better, that's what you believe.